I'm Abigail Harrison-Moore. My role within the project is an interesting one in the fact that Paul came along and said, we're interested in this, and I went, oh, that's good, but I don't actually write on that myself, although I am moving into it at the moment through a different educational project I'm working on with the extended project at the moment. But I'm an art historian, and most of my research to date has been on 19th century arts and crafts. But I was very interested in this project because I am the programme director at the moment for the MA in Art Gallery Museum Studies. I'm about to become the head of the School of Fine Art at the university. And through that role and through 15 years of teaching master's students and supervising PhDs, I've worked with a number of projects about cultural value in the digital. And so I'm going to talk about one of them today. And I need you to virtually imagine that I've got Camilla Nicol, who is the Director of Collections for Leeds Museums and Galleries, sitting here, and Rachel Forster, who I thought, this movie in digital. Rachel's here through her Twitter feed at the moment, who is a PhD student at the university, because the three of us are working on this project. And the reason I wanted to present this is it's the one that I talked to Paul most about when we were writing the original project grid for this, because I think this is a very interesting project around the use of the digital in an environment where the digital is not encouraged in any way whatsoever. So this is a PhD project. It's an HRC collaborative doctoral project. It came out of a conversation that I had with Camilla a long time ago about, wouldn't it be interesting to look at what the role of museums and objects are within a closed prison environment? Because museums are interested in working with every sort of community group going. But what about a community who could never ever hope to visit a museum? Because the prison that we're working with on this project, the majority of prisoners are on natural life sentences. So the chances are they may visit a museum, but it will be in 25 years. They may never visit a museum. What is the role of museums? And then what is the role of the digital in an environment where, because of the nature of their crimes, they are not allowed to engage with the web. They're not allowed to tweet. They're not allowed to be part of Facebook. And therefore, what is the role of the museum in relationship to that? So I'm just going to talk about the project a little bit, just to open up that interesting conversation about what is the cultural value of museums and the digital in relationship to this sort of project. It has just won 3 Koestler Awards. For those of you who don't know, Koestler is a foundation that awards prisoners for mainly art projects, so that's really exciting for us. And this image is on Rachel's Twitter feed, and it's of the day where the output of this project, which is a Cabinet of Curiosities that the prisoners involved have created, was delivered to the Discovery Centre. Anybody who wants to go and see it, it's available at the Discovery Centre, which is our open access storage site as part of Leeds Museums and Galleries. Leeds Museums and Galleries is the largest local authority museum authority in the country. It has a huge number of sites. The Discovery Centre was established at the same time as they redeveloped the museum in Leeds. Whoops, we've gone. We're going to come back. I'll leave you.
Yes.
Oh, we're back. Lovely. As a way of enabling the museum itself to be sited in the centre of Leeds in the old Institute building, but enabling the amount of objects, there's over 1 million objects, to be shown and publicly accessible. So the whole point of the Discovery Centre is opening up access to objects in museums. One of my first ever jobs as an academic, when I was funding my PhD, as you all do, anything that will come along, was working in high security prisons. And working at Wakefield High Security Prison, and it was the most interesting teaching experience I've ever had, and I've been looking for years for a way back in. Everyone else is trying to escape, I wanted a way back in. My husband agreed to stop free climbing when we first got married if I stopped working with sex offenders in prisons, but I found a way back. So this was a project about, we asked the question, what happens if we work with a Category A prison? We proposed it to the AHRC. We actually thought ourselves it was a pretty weak proposal because we weren't really sure how or what would happen with it until we actually started the project. But of course the AHRC went, whoa, this is interesting. We've never done anything like this before. So they gave us the funding. Then we had to find somebody to actually do the PhD. And thank the Lord, Rachel came along, who'd had a long history of working in education museums, in art teaching, in prisons. Her father was also a senior officer at Wakefield High Security Prison. That has helped massively in terms of security clearance. So in a project around digital, I've bought physical archives with me today, and I'm just going to pass it around. These are two of the outputs from the project. This is still, she's writing up at the moment and stressing an awful lot about that. But this was a project, the response to the first handling session, and this is a booklet that the prisons themselves have produced about the actual project. So the ambition was to take objects into the prison. That was all we set out to do. What happens when you take museum objects into the prison? How do you enable it? And then how do you record the responses to the objects? What are the role of the objects? And Rachel herself came up with the idea that this would all be about value. What is the value of a museum object in a closed high security prison? One of the big challenges for Rachel is, as I said, Wakefield High Security Prison is one of the main holding centres in the UK for people who've been convicted of sexual offences. And one of the big challenges around sexual offences is getting people to talk, because there can be a very close relationship between the work that's being done in terms of psychology within the prison and the work that you might do with a museum object. So ideas like memories and ideas about association and talking about the family, talking about childhood, all become a lot more problematic when you're working with people who have been imprisoned for the crimes that these gentlemen have been imprisoned for. So we spent a long time looking at the actually quite scant literature on what is the role of the museum in prisons. There's been some really interesting projects, for example, the Anne Frank project. There's been projects done by the British Museum with Pentonville Prison. This was the first time anyone had tried to do this sort of project. Rachel decided to work with the curators at the Discovery Centre, with all the curators, with all the collections, and ask each of them to identify a set of objects that we could potentially take in to the prison with the education team. She encountered quite a lot of interesting challenges at that point, because obviously some of the curators already had ideas about what would happen to the object if it went into the prison, problems about security, problems about conservation, preservation. But within what we're talking about today, it was absolutely vital to her, right from the beginning, to have physical objects, to have something that could be touched. She didn't want to go in, because one of the early suggestions was, what about if we create digital versions of these objects? You know, what if we take pictures of them in? And certainly the security team at the prison would have been much happier for us to take in images of the objects or films of the objects or digital versions of the objects. But the whole point was to take the actual objects in themselves. Through a process of very careful selection, which obviously will be detailed in the methodology of her PhD, they selected a range of objects which you'll see in the two publications that you're looking at, everything from a brick through to objects associated with particular religious ritual, through objects from our social history collections. There were a number of objects that the security officers at the prison rejected. So, for example, they rejected two toy cars for various different reasons. But in the end, they accepted, I think it was 20 objects went into the prison. And then there was a handling session that was enabled by the museum education team from the Discovery Centre. That was really interesting, and what this document explores is the way that the perceptions of value amongst the students changed through the handling process. So the brick was, they were asked to rate the object in the first, and the brick was obviously rated as the least valuable object, and by the end of the handling session it was right up there near the top. And one of the ways that they decided to interpret that process is they created a top trumps game. But what's interesting for our work today is working with a charity called Stretch that are based in Leeds. It's about the rehabilitation of offenders. They've done some digital storytelling projects. And we're now in the process of thinking about, well, how do we get those out there? So I think in terms of our considerations today, I was interested in thinking about, we often think about the digital as a way of engaging, marketing, talking to different publics about what museums do. One of our big challenges with this project is, how do we now talk to the public about what we did? Because there are a lot of challenges, you know, a lot of people in the public might not like the idea that these sort of projects are going on in this sort of environment with these sorts of offenders. My own experience when I worked in prison, I did a big project around the work of Willis Hall, the playwright, who was in Ilkley at the time, of which he's no longer with us. And at the end of the project, Willis was invited to come in and work with prisoners. They'd done a play for him. At the time, he was writing an article for the Yorkshire Post every week, and I said to him, you cannot write about this because there's a lot of people in Yorkshire who have very clear and quite absolutely acceptable problems with anything of this nature going on with this environment, because quite a lot of the people who are in that prison are from Yorkshire and there are long memories about their particular offences. Unfortunately, he then went out and wrote the next day an article in the Yorkshire Post, and I was hauled up in front of the governor. So we've got some really interesting challenges now. And the big question that we're asking all the way through the project is, should a museum service be doing this sort of project? And then what is the role of the digital within this project? I don't want to offer answers today because that's what Rachel's doing at the moment in terms of writing up her PhD. And unfortunately she couldn't be with us today. I did ask her, but she's on the other side of the country at the moment. But I just wanted to throw this out as an interesting case study around cultural value and the digital and what the digital role is. Now, as I say, we've done various digital, so we've done a film about this, which unfortunately I couldn't find for you today. We have done the digital storytelling project, where we got a number of the students involved in the project to talk about their response to the objects with the objects presently. What's happening now at the moment is that some of the students who are involved in the initial handling and the development of the Cabinet of Curiosities, they are now interpreting the objects for their fellow students within the prison. So there's that notion of interpretation being handed on. One of the outcomes from the project that we could have expected but perhaps didn't expect was the value of this within the community of the prison itself, and the importance of that community in terms of some of the other roles that a prison has, in terms of handling aggressive behaviour, in terms of getting people to talk about their offences, etc. So it's been seen to have a real added value within the prison environment in a way that we didn't expect it. The physical outcome of the project is the Cabinet of Curiosities. Rachel worked with all the different workshops in the prison, and the woodworking workshop produced a literal cabinet, which is full of the artworks that some of the students made in response to the objects from the prison itself. So it does have a life in its physical, but what's it going to be its life digitally? So I thought I'd just throw that one out there today as a short case study.